Welcome to everyone who's coming in just now. This session is called Outside the Box on Goods Movement. And for this session, we're really hoping to build a better understanding of some of the key trends that are emerging in the goods movement space, unpack the goods movement system to help us break down some of the silos, explore some of the impacts on different parts of the population and various aspects of the urban environment. And also, ultimately, this is a bit of a call to action for all of us working in this space to think differently and more carefully about goods movement. So we have a fully packed 5-person panel for this session. So my goal today is really to talk as fast as I can and get out of the way so that we can hear from everyone, and also to get to some of the questions at the very end. So I'm Chiu. I'm a consultant with the Emerging Mobility Strategies team at WSP, and I'm joined by my colleague, Bridget Wieghart, who's the Managing Director of the Freight and Logistics Practice at WSP. We also have Francesca Jones, who's joining us as a planner in Policy, Innovation, and Regional Collaboration from Portland Bureau of Transportation, Amity, who's a co-president of Cascadia Consulting Group, and last but not least, Brian Hamlin, Strategic Advisor in Transit and Mobility at the Seattle Department of Transportation. So we'll be presenting in that order. And before I hand my mic over to each person, I'll give you a bit more of an overview about each speaker, starting with myself. So as I mentioned, my name is Chiu. I'm part of the Emerging Mobility Strategies team at WSP. I started my career in Canada, having gone to school at the University of Waterloo for both my bachelor's and master's degrees. I come mainly from a background in urban and transportation planning. So a lot of my work is really focused on helping cities and agencies figure out how to better prepare for the future, looking at key trends and mobility and disruptions. And before the pandemic, a lot of that work was focused on looking and thinking about the impacts of emerging technologies in the mobility and transportation space. But increasingly, at least in part because of the pandemic, a lot more of this work has been diving deep into more substantial societal and economic changes, which really leads to our topic for this session. So I don't really need to say this, but e-commerce has grown significantly. It was on the rise before the pandemic, and the pandemic has only expedited it. And so as the headlines and Captain Obvious says, the COVID-19 pandemic has really accelerated our shift towards e-commerce, and some estimates say that it's accelerated it by about 5 years. And in the last year, even though retail sales only went up about 7%, online sales went up a whopping 37%. So much more on the e-commerce side rather than the brick and mortar side. And I think I'm certainly guilty of contributing to this trend. And I would bet that a lot of you who are on this call right now probably have a pile of boxes waiting at your doorstep to be opened. And so while a big part of this is definitely related to the lockdown protocols and store closures that are forcing us to rely on e-commerce, I think the convenience of all of this is likely going to make this trend continue into the future and have lasting effects. But what are these lasting effects really, and will they be good or detrimental to our cities? I think as an urbanist, that's something that's really been on my mind. And as an urbanist, my brain tends to work in webby, sometimes loopy ways. And I really just started to think about how all these different elements link together. And so from the goods movement space, we know that it has had a major impact on the brick and mortar retail landscape. So a lot of store closures across the country in many of our cities' main streets. And that's really changing the urban landscape for a lot of our cities. At the same time, there's been a growing demand for warehousing, and in particular, starting to be in urban environments. So urban warehousing that's bringing the goods closer to the people who are needing it. Also, there's a shift in the way that some of this work is being done within the goods movement space, much more reliance on gig workers who lack a lot of the protections. So job precariousness is growing into an even bigger issue than it was prior to the pandemic. and also thinking more broadly from a social inequity perspective, growing impacts on environmental justice from a lot of the trucks that are being used to transport these goods. And then on the flip side of that, inequity from a food and resource insecurity perspective. So who has access to these goods movement and last mile delivery services versus those who do not? And what does that mean for people who might not easily have access to these digital means of accessing e-commerce? And then that also leads to growing pressures on our different urban systems. So I think the most obvious side is that we have a lot of competing needs, particularly for limited urban infrastructure space at the curb, but also on our roads. And then the downstream impacts of excess consumption of the goods that are being purchased through e-commerce, and also on the tail end of excess waste. And so for me, this really reminds me of the blind men and elephants parable that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. I believe it has roots from the Indian subcontinent, but I actually learned it from Saturday Chinese school as a child. But it seems to me that the issue of goods movement is really the elephant in the room. And we're all seeing different sides of this elephant and trying to solve it in different ways in our own little pockets. And the intent of this session is really to bring together some of these speakers who are working on this issue from their different perspectives so that we can all get on the same page and see how these things come together. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic on to our first speaker, my colleague Bridget Wieghart, there we go. So before I pass it on to Bridget, let me just give her a quick intro. So Bridget Wieghart is a freight and logistics planner who specializes in urban issues. She started her career in NYC working on industrial, rail, marine, and aviation development projects. And since then, she has managed multimodal transportation plans spanning all modes and phases. Prior to joining WSP, Bridget worked at Metro in Portland, where she led the freight program and was responsible for multimodal corridor and freight planning. She was project manager of the Seattle Freight Master Plan, deputy project manager of the Toronto Freight and Goods Movement Strategy, and she is currently the consultant project manager for the 2040 Portland Freight Plan. And I'll just add a note myself that Bridget is the jack of all trades, and she touches a lot of different elements related to goods movement and beyond. So Bridget, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks, Kit. So I'm going to talk a little bit more depth about some of the overall trends that Kit mentioned at the beginning, and with a focus on the supply chain and how it has impacted the urban center. Next slide. So COVID-19 really is the Black Swan event from a risk and scenario planning perspective for freight. It really exposed supply chain vulnerabilities and inventory, some of them being inventory reduction and warehouse capacity, dependence on China, the international trade issues, asset utilization, and safe delivery protocols. So it brought up all of these different issues. And then, next slide, sorry. And so as Kit mentioned, the e-commerce, but back on the e-commerce side, the e-commerce, we're going, sorry, Kit. Next slide. There. So e-commerce really surged during the pandemic. You can see at the beginning of the pandemic, March and February, March through April 2020, e-commerce really surged. This slide, by the way, the graph is from a recent presentation that was given at TRB by the Consumer Brands Association. And what it shows is consumer products groups, sort of the consumer types of products. And it posted a year-over-year growth of 10.4. There was this huge surge at the beginning, but it did then flatten out to an overall significant growth, and it's continued. So, and it's expected to continue, as Kit mentioned. Next slide. And so what we've seen, among other things, is a growing confidence in online shopping for grocery products. And what you see on the right is before, this is from, again, a Consumer Brands Association poll, where before the pandemic, you can see that most people took, the majority took frequent small trips to the grocery store. During the pandemic, that flip-flopped. And in fact, infrequent trips were much more popular. And the prediction really is somewhere in between, that after the pandemic, you will see most people still making infrequent, larger trips to the grocery store, and really reducing their short, small trips. So this will permanently change the landscape. And let's talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So this is from a WSP survey that we did as part of the Michigan Long Range Transportation Plan, but it was national. And we interviewed supply chain companies about their short-term 3-year outlook in a number of different areas. So the green shows the increasing trends, and the yellow shows no change, and of course red shows decreasing trend. And what you see is really increasing trends in terms of automation, direct to consumer sales, more vendor locations. So they're having an increased number of sources. That was, again, as a response to the pandemic, and then more distribution centers and fulfillment centers. So again, more locations. Next slide. And so this is going to have an impact on real estate and land use resilience. We're already seeing that warehousing is in short supply in urban centers, and the increased volume of e-commerce has exacerbated this problem. So in the short term, shuttered retail has been converted to sort of mini fulfillment centers, and that's helped with the last mile solutions. But increased e-commerce, that's not really a long-term solution due to the costs of retail space versus warehousing space. So increased e-commerce demand may result in the need for higher clear height buildings and multi-story urban warehouses. And the increased demand for warehouse space may also lead to higher rents and perhaps higher cost of goods, although that remains to be seen. Next slide. Because there's a lot of uncertainty, but there's some things that we know are going to be lasting effects. So COVID, again, has exposed our reliance on manufacturing capacity in China. And there is a potential, we're acknowledging, for decentralization of manufacturing capacity, bringing some production closer to home, not necessarily within country, but nearby. Automation and small batch production has been tested and is becoming a cost-effective alternative. And there's been there is a potential push by policymakers to reconsider manufacturing abroad. So that's from the supply chain perspective. And then the next slide, we'll look at some of the effects on the urban areas. So it's accelerated, as Kit said, pre-existing trends. We believe e-commerce will still retain a significant portion of those gains it achieved during COVID. Retail will continue to flow, but again, through more online channels. So businesses have also been rethinking how much work can be done from home. I'm sure you're seeing that in your own work. Many companies are really thinking of continuing with more remote work options after the pandemic. And then also attitudes to automation have changed. People have seen some of the benefits through being required to through social distancing, and they may continue. Next slide. So we also may see, in terms of effect on the urban environment, that public gatherings and nightlife may return, but at a diminished level. There may be more home entertainment, ghost kitchens stand to gain from this. And cities will face a daunting combination. There's been a simultaneous drop in storefront retail, office space, and entertainment uses. So there's also been an increased focus, as Kit mentioned, on the health disparities during the pandemic. There's going to be an increased attention to air quality near industrial neighborhoods after the pandemic. And so there's going to be interest in electric trucks. We've already seen that growing, and more sustainable options. Thanks.
Thank you, Bridget. And now we'll pass the mic over to Francesca. So Francesca Jones is a planner in the Policy, Innovation, and Regional Collaboration section of the City of Portland Bureau of Transportation. She specializes in addressing complex and contentious planning and public policy issues, as well as designing and advising on community engagement plans and processes for the Bureau. She was most recently the Deputy Project Manager for PED-PDX, Portland's citywide pedestrian plan, which won 6 awards at local, state, national, and international levels. Born and raised in Portland, Francesca earned a bachelor's degree in planning, public policy, and management, and a master's degree in community and regional planning, and a master's degree in conflict and dispute resolution, all from the University of Oregon. So welcome home, Francesca, and I'll pass the mic to you.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm glad to get to talk about 2040 Freight, our 2040 Portland Freight Plan. And the 2040 Portland Freight Plan is about planning how to move goods through the city while meeting our goals for a safe multimodal system that supports economic prosperity, human and environmental health, equity, and resilience. We developed a freight master plan in 2006. And it was a 20-year plan that included projects for mobility, livability, and the economy. And the plan identified 6 different types of freight infrastructure improvements, from highway improvements to rail improvements, because freight is not a single mode, but many interrelated modes. A large share of the projects identified in the 2006 plan, at least 72 of them, are not city owned, but are actually the responsibility of either state, county, Port of Portland, or other public or private entities that own and operate these essential infrastructure, freight infrastructure components. So at the time, we were really convening a lot of centralized intermodal planning work for the region with this plan, without being the lead responsible implementing party for all of it. And subsequent to the 2006 Freight Master Plan was a lot of great planning work by the state of Oregon, Metro and the Port of Portland and the Oregon Department of Transportation. And the city got to participate in all of that too. And the city also accomplished a lot of great work since then, including updating our citywide comprehensive plan, our transportation system plan, which we did a major update due to a major overhaul in accordance to our comp plan, and all the many different planning processes that had built up over time. And then also with our PBOT strategic plan for how to put the comp plan and our TSP into immediate implementation. And this all includes, packaged within it, work by our climate action plan. And in fact, since our 2006 Freight Master Plan, our City Council committed to a 40% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 and 100% reduction by 2050. And in our strategic plan, we said that we would ask ourselves 2 questions in every single project we endeavor upon. And those 2 questions are, will it advance equity and address structural racism? And will it reduce carbon emissions? So then we got to ask ourselves these questions as part of a freight plan, and it is taking us in a new place here. And this is our journey that we get to travel. So we're now asking ourselves, what does it mean to accomplish a freight master plan that advances equity and addresses structural racism while reducing carbon emissions? And it's remaking our thinking every step of the way. We came up with a statement to explain how we'll do this. 2040 Freight will aim to reduce carbon emissions while advancing equity and addressing structural racism by engaging stakeholders and the public in examining relevant issues of environmental justice as part of this plan. And we realized right away this needed to impact how we talked about Portland as a place and Portland's freight history. We realized what we had been telling was actually a pretty colonist narrative about how Portland became a great center of intermodal goods movement. And we realized we immediately had to examine that to acknowledge what wasn't being said if we were being true to those 2 key questions. Portland is a city located where it is due to goods movement. That's true. And before colonized times, the original people of the land, including tribes of the Chinook and Multnomah people, traded goods with one another right here. And when white colonizers came, they found it to be the farthest accessible point of inland navigation in the 1850s and engaged in shipping and trading with native people and among white settlers here. And advantageous freight access has been one of the defining historical features of the city's growth and development. In 1883, Portland's railroad connection to the east was completed, predating rail lines to San Francisco and Seattle. And completing this rail line was honestly an objectively amazing feat of engineering amidst all kinds of challenges. However, in our narrative, we hadn't acknowledged that development of the rail lines included a lot of death and pain to our Native Americans in particular, and that a lot of skilled Chinese immigrant labor was exploited, and it was dangerous work. And the development of the rail line is what brought the community that built Portland's historic Chinatown. So now we can move goods by water and by rail. And in 1940, we added to our overall economic advantage as a center for goods trading by adding the Portland International Airport, formerly the Portland Columbia Airport. And then our trade picture here evolved with the addition of freeways. But it also should be named that those freeways also literally divided and displaced communities with particular destruction to the Black community in Portland, and especially by carving I-5 through the heart of North Portland's Albina neighborhood. So today we're an economy that is more freight dependent than most, and it's deeply rooted in our place. So we have this question, how do we bring this context into Portland of 2021, really having re-examined what our real history is, and then how do we use that moving forward to think about where we are today. And to help keep things short, because yes, we can and will and do dive into that as part of this work. We are working on a demographics, equity, and environmental justice report. And we are using a helpful framing to contextualize this work is to think about these factors through a social determinants of health framework. And this framework is used by the US Department of Health and Human Services to convey the fact that people's health depends on many factors that extend beyond an individual's healthy choices. The framework highlights the systemic nature of human health and helps illustrate the role of public health organizations and government agencies that oversee education and housing, or like PBOT, that oversees transportation as critical for improving living conditions, quality of life, and health outcomes. So the framework recognizes that inequitable social determinants of health contribute to wide health disparities and affect the environments where people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, age. And so overall, there are 5 broad categories enumerated in each of the circles here. And the ones in blue are the ones probably most closely aligned with the content of our demographics, environmental justice, and equity report work. And so this is just to say, the start of the work is here in looking at how freight not only does all these great things and is necessary, and how do we look at this in a different way that really centers people and the social determinants of health, and engages the community to help us develop projects and public policy for 2040 that is headed towards equity and reduction in carbon emissions. And this last slide here that I want to show, my team wanted me to share because this is a tangible example of how we are looking at this. For example, this is a map of the city of Portland, and it overlays diesel particulate matter concentrations on top of what we can tell are our locations of the city where we have highest concentrations of low income and communities of color. And so this is showing a disproportionate impact, communities that are already facing lots of different challenges. For example, they have less access to sidewalks and in these areas as well. And now they're also being hit with impacts of additional diesel particulate matter. So yes, as part of this planning process, we're saying, well, we care about that. We're looking at the data for that, and we want to engage the public and develop some strategies to continue to create a more equitable community.
Thanks, Francesca. I think, I guess in my review of a lot of freight master plans, it's pretty uncommon for the element of social equity to be considered within the freight environment. A lot of the times we're really focused on the efficiency of moving goods through our cities, and also just understanding like what the wear and tear on our roads is. So I think this is definitely really unique and a good starting place for a lot of other cities and agencies to build off of. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to Amity Lumper, who's going to talk to us a little bit more on the solid waste side of things, sort of tail end of this goods movement ecosystem. So Amity Lumper is the co-president of Cascadia Consulting Group. She has nearly 25 years of experience in solid waste management, recycling, and sustainability. She's collaborated with cities, corporations, and institutions throughout North America in assessing waste and material flows, designing innovative programs and policies to reduce waste, and evaluating programmatic impacts. Selected clients include the cities of Seattle, Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco, the states of Washington, Oregon, and California, UC Berkeley, University of Washington, and Georgia Tech, really long list there, and corporate clients in the high-tech, apparel, and food service NGO, and as well as NGOs, including the Recycling Partnership and various charitable foundations. Amity lives in Seattle with her husband, son, and cat, and enjoys gardening, bicycling, and cooking. I'll pass it on to you, Amity.
Wow, that was really comprehensive. Thank you so much, Kit. Really appreciate this opportunity, and Urbanism Next. Thanks for the invitation to be a part of this panel. I have learned so much already from the other panelists and look forward to learning more today, and sharing a little bit more from this unique perspective that I bring a little typically further downstream around waste, and Kit showed those cardboard boxes. That's a lot of what we're talking about here. So you can please go to the next slide. So I don't know how many of you all are familiar with the more traditional waste management hierarchy, really focused on highest and best use of materials and minimizing negative environmental impacts. And EPA has championed this, but certainly it's used across organizations. This I borrowed, not from me. You can find out more there through the link, but it's specific to packaging, the packaging waste management hierarchy. And so what we see here, looking in the middle, and sorry for the small font here, is waste minimization again at the top as where we need to focus, and then reuse, and then recycling, and then if we absolutely have to, last resort disposal, which is typically in a landfill. In our neck of the woods out here, also a lot of incineration happening, still burning of material in various ways, contained burning at commercial facilities. I want to expand, I expanded a little bit on this in the margins, and these lists can go on and on. I realize there's just more and more that can be added here, but wanted to get a little more holistic thinking about materials on the upper left there. What are key factors that influence the kinds of materials that are showing up at our curb? I mean, a lot. Durability, ability to get that product to folks not damaged after 30 plus touches and movement across all kinds of forms. The visual appeal, the optimizing for best packing and packaging, just the list goes on. Environmental considerations I've got below there. A lot of terms that get thrown out here. I really wanted to distinguish here between the abilities and then the inputs. Recycled content, we could say bio-based materials in terms of content on, and then impacts such as litter and toxicity, which bring us up to the upper right, and those social impacts. And again, this list could go on and on. We've heard a lot about congestion and air quality. I love that map. Francesca, thank you for elevating these disparities, and there's lots of disparities in the waste management sector as well. Talk a little bit more about that. Also safety, the safety considerations that come along with increased traffic and fast-paced delivery, and toxins from actual materials themselves, which we're learning more and more about, PFAS and other plastic additives, etc. And then as a segue, and actually, Kit, you can take us to the next slide, if you could, please. Thank you. So what are we trying to do here? So we're trying to move from that linear hierarchy, which is a good start, and really move from, even still today in our communities, and most of our communities, we have a take, make, waste model, a linear model, unfortunately. And so when we look at our natural systems, at these resilient, incredible systems, what we realize is we need to move to a more circular economy that keeps materials in circulation as long as possible, that creates economic and social value, and that's the moving from less bad to good. A lot of the waste language and where I come from has been focused historically on minimization and elimination and reduction, and those things are good. But we really want to move to the more good. They're valuable assets and resources here. And then when we need to return them, or remanufacture them into some other form, really looking at how we can drastically reduce that environmental footprint and contribute to regenerating and restorative systems. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, I've got there for reference. If you're not familiar with them, they're amazing. They're really leading the charge globally on circular economy with cities and corporations across the globe. They've done a lot of research through consultants and their own work. McKinsey has partnered with them to try to quantify the lost value associated with these materials that are getting discarded and could actually get remade or returned into circularity, just more utility, continuing to use materials over time that these are just some of the statistics, we could see something on the order of a 50% reduction in traffic congestion in China's cities. Something like 700 million in annual material cost savings in the consumer goods industry by returnables and refillables and getting rid of all this packaging. I'll talk more about that in a second. And then just wanted to also say I don't have them on this slide, but there are local groups doing great work, nonprofits and entrepreneurs like Circular Seattle Club, Circular PNW. So local regional groups doing some neat things out here in the Pac Northwest and across the globe, as I said. So just move to the last slide, please, Kit. Thank you. So thank you again, Brian, for the invitation to ground our presentations in the real world and real world examples. I want to give a nod here to a corporate innovation here on the left with Loop. So this is private sector. Maybe some of you are familiar with Loop. Had a pilot program in 2019 in a few select cities in the US and in Paris, France. They expanded their operation online to all consumers in the US then in 2020. And what they do is they provide home delivery of products packed in reusable packaging, and then they pick up the empty packages and reuse those. And you see some of the examples of those packages. As of November 2020, over 100,000 people in the US had signed up for service, and they were packaging, providing this service for over 80 brands and 400 products in the US and Europe, and growing. So very exciting to see that take shape. Stop Waste in the middle is in Alameda County in the beautiful San Francisco Bay Area. Actually, both of the examples on the right are California-based Bay Area. Stop Waste has had this Use Reusables program for well over a decade. They've done nationally leading award-winning work, working with mostly commercial enterprises across a variety of industries to shift to reusable shipping packaging for the most part. They've focused in a few other areas, but shipping packaging such as crates, returnable pallets, wraps, etc. A lot of interesting materials there if you can make it work in your supply chain. And then last, Berkeley, I'll close with Berkeley, also national leader, innovator. So this is another municipal example. In January 2020, so just over a year ago, they rolled out I think the most comprehensive rules around eliminating single-use disposable food service packaging and providing some reusable options, specifically around drink cups. So they're requiring restaurants and cafes to charge 25 cents for each disposable cup, and then making all to-go containers compostable. That was the second phase of that starting in July, and using reusable foodware, such as porcelain dishes, those kinds of things for customers who are dining in. So actually requiring the use of durable dishes for customers dining in. So excited to track that early on, just some great inspiring examples. And Kit, I'm sorry, I'm a few minutes over here, so hand it back to you.
Not a problem. Thanks, Amity, for going over sort of this tail end of the goods movement space. I think at least for me as a planner, a lot of times, at least from the transportation planner perspective, getting things to the door is the important part. And then we always forget about the other side of where do the things go afterwards. but I think Brian might be covering off some of those things at a more detailed level, looking at the curb. So I'm going to pass the mic on to Brian. So Brian Hamlin is a strategic advisor in transit and mobility at the Seattle DOT. He's a strategic advisor who develops policy for equitable curb use and strives for better civic data to inform the decision-making process. He's an advocate for curbside access and is a leader in balancing travel modes and curbside needs within the public right-of-way. And before coming to the West Coast, Brian worked for the New York City Department of Transportation, designing bike lanes and coordinating bike share. So Brian, take it away.
Awesome, thank you. And so what I'm going to do now is take all these great conversations and discussions we've had and tie it all together and discuss what it looks like, what kind of impact e-commerce has on that last 50 feet when it meets the curb, and what cities can do to plan for this and try to position themselves in a way that can tackle this issue head on, because it's here. It was here before COVID. Now we got to deal with it. So next slide. So what we do with curbside management, it's all about managing supply and demand. And right now there is way too much demand for our very limited amount of curb space, right? And the supply it's constrained. It's very challenging. There's very few new streets being built in cities right now. And so we have to use the space as wisely as possible that we have. It's something that's really challenging. COVID, like I mentioned to kick this off, loading was challenging before COVID, and now with the rise of e-commerce due to COVID, we're really struggling, and issues that were kind of bubbling under the surface have now been really laid bare. And we have to deal with it as city planners and policy makers, right? So what I'm going to try to do today is talk about 3 guiding principles that's really helping to guide our thought process, and hopefully everyone on the call can take some insights from it, and happy to discuss more later. But what we're going to talk about is policy and what that can do. It's kind of boring, but super important. Really big one, prepare for that digital exchange of information if you're not doing it already, and where to take it. And then willingness to be flexible. So I'm going to talk about these 3 things as we go. Next slide. Yep. So policy, very, very important. And honestly, when it comes to curbside management, the load zone is our strongest tool in our toolkit that we have when it comes to managing the rise of e-commerce and this flood of delivery vehicles, whether that's the Amazon truck or it's the Toyota Corolla that's delivering your Amazon Fresh delivery. There's so many different variations of this. So what's really important here is that we need to create policy that ensures, when we talk about complete streets, we need to absolutely maintain loading access, and we need to prioritize loading access on our curbs. I love bike lanes, I love transit lanes, but we need to think very comprehensively when we redesign our streets to ensure that some of these older buildings in different neighborhoods throughout our cities that are solely reliant on the curb to meet their access needs still have some access. And we can think very creatively. There's a lot of awesome people, designers, engineers, planners working together to make this happen. But it's crucial that your policy that's within your plans that you're creating today, or even the ones you're thinking about in the future, you just really have to elevate loading as something that is a priority. But then also I really have to stress the importance of equity when you're making these types of decisions. Like I mentioned on the first slide, COVID, among many other things, has made loading need really kind of laid bare the issues that we had. And even here in Seattle, we noticed there were certain neighborhoods, these kind of smaller commercial districts had to quickly overnight pivot to a solely online delivery platforms, right? To be able to get food for restaurants or small business, retail. All of a sudden now their deliveries are happening at the curb to keep them afloat. And what we noticed in some of these community districts is they didn't have loading. The signage did not meet the need that they actually had. because a lot of times our load zones are a request-based system. So you kind of have to be in with the system to know like how to get these 5-minute, 30-minute passenger load zone signs put out in front. So we quickly realized that and we pivoted. And now what we're trying to do is, learn from this experience. And now we're putting out load zones throughout the city to meet that need. And that's that continuous iterative process of like, this is the policy that determines and drives our decision-making process. And then I'll quickly just mention, like, some of you all might have seen this graphic in the bottom right-hand corner. Seattle does a great job of prioritizing different curb use space, but you can see in the red, access for commerce always is below modal plan priorities. So the reality is sometimes loading doesn't necessarily, it kind of gets bumped when certain complete streets projects go in. So we need to take a look at that and improve our policy, because loading is very, very important when it comes to managing the future here. Next slide. 2, very, very important, is prepare for this digital exchange of information. I think one of the best examples I have, because this has happened to me, you work really hard to get the most perfect load zone put in place in your city. You work with the local business, they're very excited, you're meeting their need. You line this load zone on the far side of a big driveway, so it's got very easy in and out access for a driver, delivery driver, right? You go out there to show your friend because you're a policy wonk like me, and you gotta show it off, and you see the delivery truck that's parked 40 feet down the street that didn't actually see your load zone, and they're double parked in the middle of the road. And it's like, what happened here? So what our goal is we spend all this time working on policy, is we want to be able to tell these companies like, hey, the load zone is here, right? And how do we do that in a way that's not just sending a shapefile via email? Is we need to set up these kind of API endpoints so we can have this digital exchange information. So if there's a street closure, there's a new load zone that goes in that's 35 feet long, you should be able to express that to the curb users that need that information, which will, reduce congestion, improve traffic safety, you name it, it'll go through the list. So it's really, really important. And then to tie that off is it creates, once everything is fully digitized, and mind you, we're still moving towards this. Seattle is not perfect. This is a goal we have, is we want to have create this feedback loop where we can analyze what we do. So we implement a policy, we put it on the street, we get that data back, and we say, hey, it's not working so well, and we can shift it. We can just do this way faster than we're currently doing it. So that's the end goal here, and we're moving towards it. Next slide. And then finally, you just really have to be flexible, because it's overwhelming. Historically, cities move very slow when it comes to technology and embracing new and innovative things. But what we found, and as I mentioned before, like, we've had to get very creative during the pandemic, where you can see in the upper right photo here, we created these food pickup priority zones, but this is a passenger loading zone sign. So technically the unloading of goods and services is like not technically allowed there. So that's a policy that doesn't actually meet the need, but we had to think creatively and create a system that could work temporarily, that then we can build on and create the municipal code change later on. So it's really important to just sometimes you got to stretch the rules a little bit to find what works. And part of that is pilots are very, very important. They can be your friend. Sometimes, like anything, they can be a little overwhelming, but it's another opportunity to test different scenarios, different things that align with your policy goals. Does it get you closer to what you want? That also works with that data exchange. You can test out and start to pilot different technologies that are out there. Plenty of different private companies that will help you work through this. Not that OMF, they're not necessarily a private company, but they're helping cities work through this very complicated issue. And then finally, like, work with other cities. Every city is going through this same issue. Sometimes pilots can be kind of expensive, or different programs can be kind of pricey. But if you can work together with maybe some neighboring cities, think regionally, you can bring costs down and really test out and learn things so you can adapt and move forward and just meet this just onslaught of deliveries that are happening within our cities, because we have to think creatively and we got to try to get ahead of it somehow. So hopefully these 3 guidelines, it's not going to solve everything, but it'll get you a little bit closer. And I think that's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian, for helping us ground our discussion today and some of the things that the City of Seattle is already doing. And I guess going back, thank you to all our panelists for your presentations. I think you've covered a lot of different aspects of this goods movement problem and helped us to tackle it from different perspectives. We have a few minutes left, so maybe we can dive into some questions. And I think I'll start with one, and I see there's at least one question in the chat box already. If there's any other questions from the audience, feel free to throw them in. But my question to start is really, I guess, hearing from Bridget, who laid out all these major trends in the goods movement space, and in particular, the pressures from increased urban warehousing against some of the impacts that the brick and mortar retail sector is facing, as well as Francesca highlighting some of those social inequities associated with goods movement, and Amity bringing up the pressures that the solid waste system at the tail end are experienced from this shift. And then Brian mentioning the, especially on the curbs and in the urban landscape, some of those pressures there. I just want to get understanding from each of you, maybe one quick thing that our cities and agencies should be thinking about or doing right away to get us moving in this space and get us to start acting and being able to respond to this big goods movement challenge. So I'll leave it up to you. Who wants to speak first? I see Francesca, you unmuted your mic.
Sure. Just short and sweet, what City of Portland would say is reduce carbon emissions and look at equity. And so, you know, we need to combat climate change, and freight has a role in that. You know, we want to do the best we can within every realm of influence that we can touch. And we know that this is an opportunity, the freight realm is an opportunity to help us reach that goal of eliminating reducing our carbon emissions by 2050. We said we would have 100% reduction. I mean, that's incredibly hard work to get to that point. So we need to be doing every single thing we can. And so that means a really deep dive. And if we're to do that right, we're going to need to look at equity, racial equity, who benefits, who burdens from different choices that we're making in both projects and the public policy and other decision-making, the programs that we're doing that are supporting freight in our community.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to answer that one?
Sure. Well, as you know, Kit, I have a hard time limiting myself to one thing the cities could do or municipalities, but I've been really excited by the increased appreciation of freight that has happened during COVID. And I just want, I'm so passionate about freight. I just want people to know freight isn't going away. And a lot of time in the past, a lack of understanding of the role and needs of freight has led to policies that really ultimately have more negative environmental and economic impacts, such as pushing industry and warehousing out of urban centers, leading to longer trips and loss of key industries. So what I would hope, the one thing people would do is seek to understand and consider the needs of freight as you address these negative impacts of freight. So, you know, with this in mind, proactively manage your assets and tools to, you know, protect available properties for close-in warehousing and distribution or reuse of vacant retail, providing low emissions fuel infrastructure, managing the curb that allows goods movement. Thank you, Brian. And proactively gathering and analyzing data about and from all curbside users. So a few things.
Great, thank you.
And
No,
Kit, I had that slide. I don't know if it's convenient. If it's not, that's fine. But mine is very tactical around digitizing and tracking your assets. And cities are doing this right in our backyard here in Seattle and San Francisco and LA, and they're often built into new contract cycles with service providers. But I'm talking about adding sensors to various kinds of sensors to dumpsters and carts, collection containers, surveillance, video, camera on trucks. And again, this is happening, and equipping drivers with tablets to track the information, understand, manage the assets, track service and health disparities across communities. That is real. And recover revenues, charge customers based on a more granular level, get more down to a per pound or gallon versus static dumpster sizes when we're collecting half full containers much of the time, and also could potentially see technology that could potentially equip us to charge based on the kinds of materials if there's problematic materials in there. So just excited about that potential, and it's, you know, still kind of bleeding edge, but we're getting there, and encourage you to do that to just manage what you're measuring here, and the technology is here and becoming more scalable.
Thank you. And lastly, Brian.
Yes, I can tie this off. It might sound a little basic, but if one thing cities can do, and I love technology, but if your curb space is not actually doing the work that you need it to be doing, that's a huge problem. And a lot of times you have to think creatively about that curb space, and it could often mean, and it should often mean, do not prioritize on-street storage of vehicles. And if you do, you charge for it to increase that turnover. Because if vehicles just sit there at the curb all day, that freight access, that loading access, it's never going to happen. You know, you can have the most perfect data exchange in the world, but if you don't have load zones that are where they need to be, the whole system falls apart. And that's especially crucial in marginalized communities. You have to go out and talk to communities, because it's absolutely not always planner knows best. You need to know what these communities need, and you need to make it work for them. And it's really important. It takes hours, it takes staff, but you need to budget for it.
Awesome, thank you. And I see in the chat that we had a question from Tammy Chen, and I think Bridget answered it, but the question was, what's the impact and effect of having urban distribution centers in urban areas? Do they really generate more trips? Given these deliveries would occur in smaller vehicles and deliveries are consolidated. And I actually wanted to add to that question a little bit, because I think it is true that having urban distribution centers would decrease the trip distances, and having smaller vehicles and deliveries or smaller delivery vehicles would reduce that environmental impact. But I'm actually curious about the land use implications and the impact on urban vitality of our cities as we're shifting towards more urban distribution centers. Anyone have any thoughts on how that, I guess, competition for land use within our urban environments could play out? Because I think one thing that we really don't want is for a mass shift towards distribution centers that comes at a cost to our main streets.
I can go very quickly. I am not a land use planner, full disclosure, but I do know this is something we just really are not prepared for. Talking about policy, we really need to take a step back and see, does our land use policy, because on one hand, you know, I think we do want to encourage that to a certain degree, but you don't want to be overwhelmed by it. And I think it's going to take some really deep thinking and figure out the best way to move forward on this. Because you can incentivize the zero emission, low emission vehicles at the curb and like what vehicles move around your city. But if they're just taking over all Main Street, these mini warehouse centers, that's an issue.
Yeah, it doesn't sound too inviting, the image of the city being full of just distribution, but I think we do need to keep in mind that storefront retail is declining. And there's going to be a lot of properties available. And people want more home delivery. I mean, I'm more old school. I get very few packages. I never have packages at home, but my daughter gets lots of them. So I think that it's just, we need to accommodate that trend. But I think it's a very good point that you want to still figure out how to make cities vital without sort of causing lots of negative impacts by pushing uses that just really are more efficiently located in the city there. Maybe the cities are going to look different. We don't know exactly how.
Great, thank you. And we're actually, I think, 2 minutes over time, so I hope that people are still sticking around. I guess before everyone logs off, I just wanted to say thanks again to all our panelists for presenting today. We've covered a lot of ground and a lot of different perspectives here, so hopefully you've been able to learn something from our session. And I guess a few of us can stick around for a few more minutes if there's any other questions. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the Urbanism Next conference and have a great weekend.